She showed up at the hospital carrying a newborn in her arms, only to hear the words that shattered her world. You have no home to return to. But what no one knew was that this abandoned mother was about to expose a lie so cruel, so carefully hidden, it would make everyone regret the day they turned their backs on her. Read on, because the moment she stops crying, everything changes. The Way Home. Chapter 1. The Slap at the Company Gate. Late on a Friday afternoon, just as the lights in the Grand Meridian building switched on, Claire Hale stepped out through the revolving doors with a stack of files in her arms. The last heat of summer still clung to the pavement. Office workers poured out of the lobby in a tired stream, their voices mixing with traffic and the dry smell of hot asphalt. Claire had barely lowered her eyes to check her phone when she heard the hard, urgent click of high heels racing toward her. The slap landed before she could look up. Her left ear rang. The folders flew from her arms and scattered over the stone steps, receipts and printouts spinning in the air conditioning draft from the entrance. The woman standing in front of her was visibly pregnant, breathing hard, her hair loose, her eyes swollen red. She pointed straight at Claire and shouted in a voice sharp enough to cut through the crowd. "You shameless woman! How dare you go after my husband?" Silence held the crowd for only a beat. Then came the whispers, fast and eager, like dry grass catching fire. Security had not even reached them before phones were already raised. Claire stepped back, her cheek burning, her thoughts momentarily blank. It took her 2 seconds to recognize the woman accusing her. Vivian Quinn, wife of Adrian Quinn, the company's executive vice president for finance, and the man who approved budgets for Claire's communications team. Vivian thrust a phone toward her face. On the screen were screenshots of messages saved under the name Claire, a photograph of a man's hand resting over a woman's wrist in a car, restaurant receipts, transfer notifications, the kind of fragments that seemed convincing precisely because they were incomplete. Claire stared at the images and felt cold flood her spine. She had never written those messages. The hand in the photograph was not hers, but under 100 hungry stares, denial felt frail and weightless. Then Adrian came out of the building in a loosened tie and a white dress shirt, carrying the exact expression a man wears when he wants to look dragged unwillingly into someone else's chaos. He held Vivian's shoulders and told her to calm down for the baby's sake. She turned to him and demanded an answer. Was Claire the woman? For 1 second, Adrian said nothing. That silence was all the verdict the crowd needed. Claire understood in that instant that his refusal to speak was not confusion, it was consent. By the time she got into a taxi, the first video of the confrontation had already been cut, captioned, and posted online. Mistress confronted by pregnant wife. Young staffer caught chasing her boss. The phrases arrived in waves, each one filthier than the last. Her phone shook with internal group messages from coworkers pretending to be shocked and privately thrilled. Her mother called while the car turned onto the street near the hospital where Claire's father was still recovering from a stroke. Claire stared at the screen and could not answer. She was afraid of hearing what the internet had already made of her. When the taxi stopped in front of the old apartment block, Claire sat still for a long moment and looked at her reflection in the window. 5 finger marks had risen clearly on her cheek. She thought of her childhood, of evenings when her mother used to stand in the corridor waiting for her to come home from school, relieved the moment she saw her daughter step through the gate. That simple sight had once meant the household was intact. Now she climbed out of the car feeling as though every familiar door in her life had been quietly shut. Before midnight, she received a message from an unknown number. Tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Suntrace Cafe. You should hear me out before this goes any further. He did not sign his name. He did not need to. Chapter 2. The Night of Comments. At 10 that night, the first post using Claire Hale's full name and workplace appeared on a gossip forum. Within half an hour, an old scan of her identification card had been dug up from some long-forgotten delivery registration. Her parents' address, her mother's phone number, even an old photograph of her father in a wheelchair outside the hospital found their way into a crowd-assembled file on her morality. The people reading it did not know her, yet spoke with perfect certainty. They said her eyes looked greedy. They said women in communications always knew how to dress and talk their way into married men's lives. They said a slap was too gentle for someone like her. Someone clipped the video of the confrontation to dramatic music and covered it in blood-red lettering, "Don't let the other woman live in peace." Claire sat at the kitchen table beneath the weak yellow light while her mother placed a bowl of porridge in front of her and never touched her own. In the next room, her father slept badly, the breathing machine rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. The small apartment seemed stretched between three separate burdens: illness, money, and shame. Her mother did not raise her voice when she finally asked, "Tell me honestly, is there anything I don't know?" Claire shook her head. "No, he set me up." Her mother was quiet for a long time before answering. "I believe you, but strangers don't care whether you are true or false. They only want a story they can repeat." The words were gentle, yet they cut cleanly. Claire knew her mother was not accusing her. She was simply naming the world as it was. The next morning, Human Resources called and asked her not to come into the office until public sentiment had stabilized. The company was reviewing the matter, they said. They hoped she would cooperate and avoid statements that might damage the group's image. Claire asked what they planned to do about her own reputation. A small silence opened on the line. "We'll discuss that later," came the answer. By then, she already knew what the delay meant. The company was weighing which loss mattered more, the truth or the executive who had more power. Adrian was waiting for her at Suntrace Cafe in a pressed pale blue shirt, an almost empty Americano in front of him, wearing the expression of a reasonable man inconvenienced by a difficult situation. Claire sat down and said she did not have much time. He began softly, with apologies shaped to sound responsible. Vivian was unstable because of the pregnancy. The posts online had gotten out of hand. If Claire would stay quiet for a few days, he said, he could calm his wife, protect the company, and eventually restore order. Claire asked him why he had stayed silent when Vivian demanded an answer at the date. Adrian folded his hands, because any denial in that moment would have made her spiral harder. He spoke as though he were the exhausted guardian of everyone else's emotions. Then he lowered his voice and leaned forward. If Claire insisted on fighting publicly, he warned, the crowd would only tear her apart more brutally. Her father's condition, her family's address, her employment record, all of it could become collateral damage. He did not need to threaten her directly. The structure of the threat already sat between them. She left the cafe without finishing her drink. Outside, the city was bright and indifferent, the sidewalks full of people who had already scrolled past one version of her life and were ready for another. That night, the comments multiplied. So did the edits, the lies, the stitched-together screenshots. Yet somewhere beneath the humiliation, something in Claire hardened. Not into anger yet, into recognition. Adrian Quinn was not frightened, he was managing a narrative, and if he was working this hard to control it, then the truth had to be dangerous to him. Chapter 3. The Man Outside the Circle. 3 days later, Claire was summoned to an internal discussion on the 17th floor. The conference room was colder than usual. On the table sat bottled water, tissues, and a prepared notice filled with polished, bloodless phrases. Temporary suspension, pending review of concerns related to professional ethics. Miranda Lee, the communications director who had once praised Claire for her speed and judgment in a crisis, now looked at her not as a valued employee, but as a risk that needed to be contained. No one in the room openly declared her guilty. That would have required courage and ownership. Instead, they spoke in the language institutions use when they want to bury a person without leaving fingerprints. The company must protect its image. Partners were asking questions. It was best for everyone if Claire stepped back quietly. Claire asked whether everyone meant the company or Adrian Quinn. The room stiffened. Miranda told her to be careful with accusations against senior leadership. Claire replied that the man who had helped spread the lie was the same man being protected by the system, now pretending to review it. They asked if she had evidence. She said she was collecting it. They told her to return when she had proof. She refused to sign the suspension notice, photographed it instead, and said any further response would come through legal counsel. As she walked out, she found Adrian standing at the far end of the corridor beside the glass wall overlooking the parking lot, as composed as a man who still believed the board belonged to him. He told her she was making this harder than it needed to be. Claire answered that he had mistaken her silence for weakness. The person who helped her first was Elise Shaw, a lawyer and college friend with a mind like tempered steel. Elise did not waste time on outrage. She made lists. Preserve every link, capture every post before deletion, request formal timestamps from the platforms, separate what can be proven from what only feels obvious. Claire followed instructions the way drowning people follow the shape of a rope. She spent her mornings at the hospital with her father, her afternoons at Elise's office, and her nights archiving abuse before it vanished. Work did not erase humiliation, but it stopped it from swallowing her whole. Then a message arrived from Chloe Young, a young intern from the communications department. "I want to tell you something, but I can't meet at the office." They met in a copy shop near the university. Chloe came in a cap and mask, terrified of being seen, and slid a USB drive across the table with trembling fingers. It contained footage from the underground parking garage on the morning of the incident. In the video, Vivian and Adrian were already in the basement together before the confrontation. Adrian pointed toward the employee elevator more than once, showed Vivian something on his phone, then sent her upstairs ahead of him. It was not enough to prove every detail of the smear campaign, but it destroyed the claim that Vivian had acted on pure impulse. The encounter had been staged, or at the very least guided. Elise enlarged the frames one by one until Adrian's half-smile appeared reflected in the glass beside the car. Not a happy smile, but the small, satisfied expression of a man sure he was holding the strings. He arranged the conditions, Elise said. That's enough to begin breaking the story open. Elise then called in a journalist she trusted, Mason Reed. She had not seen him in almost a year. He was her former boyfriend, now reporting on corporate abuse and institutional corruption, and their separation had not come from betrayal, but from distance, illness in her family, and the slow exhaustion of timing. When he walked into the office, he did not offer pity. He opened his recorder and asked one question: "Do you want me involved as a reporter, or do you want me to teach you how not to be buried?" Claire answered, "Both." Later that night, Mason sent her the opening draft of an investigation. It began with a line Claire would not forget. When a woman is hung up for public judgment, society's first question is usually what she did wrong, not who built the scaffold beneath her. For the first time since the slap, she felt a narrow crack open in the wall around her. It was not light exactly, but it was air. Chapter 4. The Pregnant Wife. If anyone had asked Vivian Quinn what kind of woman she disliked most, she would once have answered without hesitation, the kind who looked too calm. Vivian had always lived with her feelings near the surface. She laughed loudly, cried openly, trusted wholeheartedly, and when hurt, bled all the way through. Women like Claire, measured, quiet, apparently composed even under pressure, made Vivian feel clumsy, exposed, even provincial. Long before the confrontation at the company gate, that difference had already become a private discomfort she could not explain. She first noticed Claire at the company year-end party the previous winter. The scheduled host lost her voice, and Claire stepped in at the last minute in a dark blue dress, speaking with quick intelligence and effortless poise. Vivian had been sitting beside Adrian that night. She saw the extra second his gaze lingered on the stage. It was only a second, perhaps nothing at all, but wives become fluent in minute shifts. From then on, the name Claire Hale lodged somewhere in Vivian's memory. Her marriage to Adrian had never been as smooth as it looked. They had been married 4 years and had already lost 2 pregnancies. Each loss seemed to grieve Adrian's mother more visibly than Adrian himself. Mrs. Quinn watched Vivian's body with a mixture of hope and scrutiny, as if her daughter-in-law were land in which too much had been invested without proper return. By the time Vivian reached the 3rd pregnancy and crossed into the 7th month, the entire household treated the baby like a strategic project. Mrs. Quinn forced her to stop working, monitored her meals, and timed her naps. Adrian became gentler, more attentive, and somehow more absent at the same time. Then one night, at 2 in the morning, Adrian's phone lit up beside the bed. Vivian still remembered how cold her fingers felt when she picked it up. Most of the conversation had been deleted, but the surviving fragments were enough to feed the imagination of a pregnant wife who had not slept well in weeks. There were transfers, a dinner reservation, a photograph of a woman's hand near a coffee cup, and the contact name attached to the thread was Claire. The next day, Vivian confronted him. Adrian did not collapse in guilt. He sighed instead, the sigh of a man already tired of other people's emotions. He told her Claire had developed feelings for him. He had rejected her, he said, but work required contact, and he had been afraid telling Vivian sooner would only upset her. The lie worked because it leaned against pieces of reality. Vivian knew Claire was attractive. She knew Adrian and Claire occasionally met for work. She knew he had once complimented the communications team for handling a difficult campaign well. Those thin facts were enough for the rest to arrange themselves into a believable picture. The slap at the gate had not come from nowhere. It had been built by 3 sleepless nights, repeated readings of doctored messages, the exhaustion of a difficult pregnancy, and the loneliness of suspecting that while her body was being treated like a vessel, her husband's attention had drifted elsewhere. Yet after the confrontation, Vivian did not feel triumph. She felt her abdomen harden and her chest tighten with a fear she could not name. Online sympathy for the wronged wife wrapped around her like comfort and handcuffs at once. If she had misjudged Claire, then she was not merely wounded, she was cruel. After the scandal broke, Adrian became even more attentive at home. He cooked porridge, rubbed Vivian's swollen feet, drove her to appointments, and gently changed the subject whenever she asked whether they should publicly apologize if things were not as clear as he claimed. At dinner, Mrs. Quinn spoke of the baby not as a child to be loved, but as a test to be passed, an heir to be produced. Vivian lay awake that night with her hand over her stomach and whispered sorry to the daughter not yet born. At the time, she still did not understand how large a price that apology would one day contain. Chapter 5. The Handprint on the Glass. After filing her formal complaint, Claire began living by the clock of evidence. Mornings belonged to the hospital and her father's physiotherapy schedule. Afternoons belonged to Elise Shaw's office. Nights belonged to links, screenshots, preserved metadata, notarized captures, and written statements stripped of unnecessary emotion but heavy with fact. She learned faster than she wanted to how to request confirmation from phone carriers, how to archive deleted posts from social platforms, how to draft a witness statement that would survive contempt from both lawyers and the public. The shame did not leave simply because she kept busy. It still stared at her from neighbors who suddenly paused in the elevator, from women who lowered their voices when she entered a pharmacy, from the strange look of recognition in the cashier's face at a convenience store. But work kept humiliation from becoming the whole shape of her day. Evidence gave structure to pain. One afternoon, Chloe Young, the intern who had delivered the basement footage, contacted Claire again and admitted what fear had kept her from saying sooner. The day the scandal broke, she had noticed a rush contract in a secondary server folder labeled as crisis management spending. The invoice matched a seeding operation, paid amplification, comment shaping, directional outrage. The order had been processed on the very day of the confrontation. That meant the spread of the story was not organic. Someone had prepared channels for it. Elise enlarged the garage footage frame by frame. Near Pillar 8, Adrian's palm remained for a moment on the glass of his car, a pale mark beside Vivian's blurred profile. He stood close to her, pointed toward the elevator, then handed over the phone. In that frozen image, Claire finally recognized the look that had flashed across his face outside the building. It was calculation. He had not lost control that day. He had choreographed enough of the scene to let the crowd finish the rest. Mason Reed began working the story from the outside. He contacted sources in the company, traced budget anomalies, and asked quiet questions no executive likes hearing. Claire had loved him once for the steadiness with which he listened. That steadiness had not left him. What had changed was the distance adulthood had put between them. Yet in the small office late at night, while they compared timelines and reconstructed lies, the silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited by unfinished trust. Mason's first unpublished draft did not try to win sympathy through melodrama. It asked a better question. Who benefits when a young woman becomes the center of collective rage? The article laid out the irregularities without begging the reader to be kind. That was what Claire appreciated most. Pity had always carried humiliation inside it, but scrutiny, clear, patient, unsparing scrutiny, could open a door that sentiment never would. That night, Adrian texted her again. "You're pushing a pregnant woman to the edge. Don't regret this later." Claire stared at the message for a long time before taking a screenshot and saving it in a folder she named Beginning. She did not reply. The threat was almost elegant in its reversal. He had built the machinery that turned her into prey, and now he wanted history to record him as the man trying to protect a fragile wife. Claire finally understood that she was no longer only defending herself. She was walking into the interior of something much larger than a personal scandal. A system had spoken through him. Now it was her turn to answer. Chapter 6. The Pregnancy and the Prophecy. By the 32nd week of pregnancy, Vivian's feet had begun to swell badly. The doctor warned her to rest, avoid stress, and stay calm, but in the Quinn household, calm was treated like a decorative word rather than a real condition. Mrs. Quinn came into the bedroom every day to inspect meals, supplements, and sleep, then used the same visit to remind her daughter-in-law that after this baby there must still be a son, no matter what. Vivian, exhausted and sore, asked what century her mother-in-law thought they were living in. Mrs. Quinn answered that daughters marry out, but sons keep the family line. The argument sharpened when Mrs. Quinn invited a spiritual medium from the outskirts of the city into the house. Vivian had never believed in such things, but pregnancy had left her too tired to fight every absurdity. The woman in brown beads looked once at Vivian's stomach and clicked her tongue. The child, she declared, carried heavy yin energy. If born at the wrong hour, the baby could bring misfortune to the household. Certain rituals would be necessary. The infant should not be taken directly into the main house after birth. Mrs. Quinn listened with devout attention. Vivian felt something inside her go cold. That night, she asked Adrian whether he truly believed an unborn child could enter the world already branded as bad luck. He did not laugh at the idea. He only said that if a small ritual would reassure his mother, what was the harm? Vivian pressed her palm over the baby's movements beneath her skin and said the harm was the absence of welcome. Adrian answered with one of his favorite words, peace. He only wanted the family to stay peaceful. Vivian had heard that word all through their marriage. Peace, she eventually realized, often meant that no one should demand any real change from the man using it. Outside the house, public opinion around Claire was beginning to split. Mason's first investigative piece had not exposed everything, but it had raised enough inconsistencies to make some readers question the original story. Why had the video spread so fast, as if distribution channels were ready? Why were the screenshots inconsistent? Why had the company suspended Claire before any genuine review? Vivian read those questions late at night while Adrian slept. She felt herself standing between two cliffs, believe her husband or admit she might have struck the wrong woman in public. Neither side looked survivable. One evening, while Adrian was out, Vivian opened his laptop. The password was their wedding date, a detail that might once have touched her. In a secondary email folder, she found a rushed internal approval for image crisis management spending, dated the same day as the confrontation. Attached to it was a contract with a social media seeding firm. In a temporary desktop folder, she found edited files, one still named Claire_chat Final 2. Vivian sat frozen. The real horror was no longer the possibility of adultery. It was the realization that her husband could sit at a computer, methodically build another woman into a sacrifice, then come home and place his hand on her stomach, asking whether the baby had been lively today. When Adrian returned, he did not panic at the sight of the open laptop. He closed the bedroom door and told Vivian she should not upset herself in her condition. She asked him what the files were. He answered with a calmness more frightening than denial, a necessary correction. If he had not steered the story, he said, then Vivian herself would have become the joke, the hysterical pregnant wife who attacked an innocent employee in public. He had redirected the narrative for the good of the family. Vivian asked for whose good? Adrian said, ours. She threw a pillow at him and shouted that he had used her as an excuse to destroy another woman. For the first time in months, he let anger show. He grabbed her shoulders and demanded to know whether she wanted the world to mock her as unstable before their child was even born. Vivian pulled away, a crab slicing through her abdomen so sharply that sweat broke over her skin. By midnight, she was in an ambulance on the way to the hospital because of early contractions. Beneath the white ceiling of the vehicle, with the siren tearing through the dark, Vivian suddenly saw Claire's face as it had looked after the slap, stunned, humiliated, but not screaming. The memory hurt more than she expected. For the first time, Vivian wanted to see Claire again, not to accuse her, but to ask the question she had finally begun to fear. How wrong had I been?
Chapter 7. The Article and the Early Labor. Mason's first investigation went live on a Monday morning, just as office workers across the city were opening their laptops. The headline did not use the words mistress or scandal. It asked instead what happens when a corporation chooses silence in the face of signs that a public smear may have been orchestrated. Inside the piece, Mason did not beg the audience to feel sorry for Claire. He allowed the evidence to speak. The parking garage footage showing Adrian and Vivian together before the confrontation, the inconsistent screenshots, the same-day seeding contract, the company's rushed suspension of an employee before any verified findings. The article struck harder than Claire expected because it touched a fear larger than her own case. If the evidence held, then this had not been a spontaneous moral drama at all. It had been a hunt. And if it could happen to Claire, it could happen to anyone unlucky enough to fit the crowd's existing prejudice. The comments did not suddenly turn kind, but for the first time some of them questioned the machinery instead of merely feeding it. One reader wrote, "This wasn't jealousy, it was organized pursuit." Those words rang in Claire's chest like a bell. The company released a brief statement denying any orchestrated attempt to defame a private citizen and claiming full cooperation with internal review. Adrian remained publicly silent, measuring no doubt which limb of the story could be sacrificed to save the body. Vivian, meanwhile, had been hospitalized for monitoring because of rising blood pressure and the risk of premature labor. Nurses praised Adrian's care whenever they saw him peeling fruit by her bedside or adjusting her blanket. Only Vivian knew that once the hospital room door closed, his tenderness felt more like set decoration than love. When she confronted him there, Adrian tried once again to blame pregnancy for her perceptions. Vivian told him not to hide behind the baby. She was not delusional. Later, under the pretense of apologizing to Claire, Vivian asked through an intermediary to meet her across from the hospital in a small cafe. Claire went reluctantly. Vivian looked drawn and pale, but there was no fury in her this time. There was ruin. She said she had found files on Adrian's computer and now knew Claire had been framed. She did not ask to be forgiven. She asked what kind of woman she had become. Claire did not rush to comfort her. Pain deserved truth before solace.
She said the slap had changed more than one afternoon. It had made strangers feel entitled to enter her family's life and contaminate everything fragile in it. Vivian nodded and cried without drama, as though tears had finally run out of argument. She said there was something else Claire needed to know. Adrian's mother had been treating the unborn baby as an omen, and the household had begun to speak of rituals, bad timing, and misfortune. Claire had seen many forms of cruelty since the scandal broke, but superstition directed at a child not yet born chilled her differently. Before they could finish talking, Vivian's water broke. The glass in her hand shattered on the floor, her face drained of color. Claire and a security guard rushed her across the street toward the obstetrics emergency entrance, while Vivian clutched Claire's wrist with a strength born entirely of fear. "If anything happens," she gasped between contractions, "don't let them do anything to my daughter." Claire tried to calm her, but she could feel the panic traveling through Vivian like electricity. The emergency room doors closed behind the gurney and left Claire in a corridor full of antiseptic smell and fluorescent light. Her own hands still carried sticky traces from the drink spilled during the collapse. In that sterile brightness, something became clear to her with terrible force. The fear in Vivian's eyes was larger than fear of losing a husband, larger even than fear of being wrong. It was the fear of a mother who already knew the people around her were capable of calling harm a tradition and control a form of care. Claire stood there listening to distant footsteps and understood that whatever happened next would alter the meaning of this fight forever.
Chapter 8. The Baby Who Did Not Cry. Vivian was taken into surgery that same night. Claire had no standing as family, so she could only sit in the corridor on a hard plastic chair until Adrian arrived 20 minutes later with his shirt half-buttoned and his concern arranged carefully on his face. He asked what she was doing there. Claire told him Vivian had asked to meet and had gone into labor at the cafe. Adrian looked at her as if trying to calculate which version of the next hour would serve him best. Before he could say more, Mrs. Quinn stormed in with relatives trailing behind her and nearly lunged at Claire before a nurse stopped her. The scene outside the operating room was unbearable in its absurdity. Inside, a woman lay opened by surgery at the border between life and death. Outside, the family still had enough energy to perform outrage and preserve hierarchy. Mason and Elise arrived after Claire texted them. Mason began recording openly the moment Mrs. Quinn switched from accusation to loud theatrical weeping about family tragedy. That alone was enough to make her pull back a little. Nearly an hour later, the doctor emerged with the exhausted expression of someone already carrying bad news in his body. The mother, he said, was stable for the moment, but the baby had been delivered in severe respiratory distress and had shown signs of a weakened heartbeat even before birth. They had done what they could. The corridor seemed to hollow around the unfinished sentence. Adrian closed his eyes. Mrs. Quinn began to sob loudly. Claire felt the strange numbness that comes when a room contains too much pain and too much performance at once. When Vivian woke and realized her daughter was gone, grief did not explode. It narrowed. She asked first to see the baby. Then, once the tiny wrapped body was placed in her arms for a final moment, she would not let go. Mrs. Quinn told the nurses it was not good for a recovering mother to hold on like that. A relative muttered that the dead had to be handled in the proper way. Vivian answered with a voice so hoarse it seemed pulled over broken glass. "Give her back to me. I will take my daughter home, myself."
The hospital tried to avoid open conflict by moving the baby temporarily to a private room until the family could agree, but by the time Claire returned later that morning with Elise, Vivian had somehow persuaded a nurse to let her see the child again, and was now sitting on a bench at the end of the corridor clutching the small white bundle to her chest. She looked almost bloodless. The IV had come loose from her hand. Her bandages showed red through the gauze. Every time someone stepped closer, she tightened her arms. Adrian, Mrs. Quinn, and several relatives circled her with alternating softness and force. "Don't be stubborn. Let your mother help. There are rules for the dead. You're making a scene." Vivian bowed over the bundle and kept repeating only one thing. "No, I'm taking my daughter home." When Claire approached, Vivian looked at her with the desperation of someone reaching for the last fixed object in a room already collapsing. "They want to take her from me," she said. Elise immediately reminded the family that a woman who had just undergone surgery could not be physically handled or deprived of her child without serious legal consequences. For a few hours that warning held. Then someone in the extended family filmed the scene and sent it out with embellishments. By afternoon, the next storm was already gathering, not around an accusation of infidelity this time, but around a mother who refused to surrender her dead daughter to the superstitions of a house that had never truly welcomed the child at all. Claire understood then that the first scandal had only been an opening act. The deeper cruelty had not even taken the stage yet. Chapter 9. The Way Home.
News of the mother refusing to let go of her dead newborn spread with terrifying speed. A relative posted a video and narrated it as though Vivian had become irrational after childbirth, possessed by grief, refusing to obey elders who only wanted what was best. Within an hour, acquaintances, distant relatives, and curious neighborhood women had started drifting toward the maternity ward corridor as if there were a spectacle there worth seeing. Claire felt cold watching it happen. A woman had lost her baby, was barely conscious beneath pain medication, and still people came not to protect her, but to decide whether she was pitiable, hysterical, or dangerous. Crowds are often cruelest without ever touching the body in front of them. They only have to gather, whisper, and stare at the weakest person in the room. Vivian sat hunched at the far end of the corridor, face white as paper, clutching the tiny bundle wrapped in white cloth. The blood from her loosened bandage had begun to stain through. A young nurse tried to guide her back to bed, but Vivian shook her head. "If I go back to the room, they will take her." Mrs. Quinn was still crying loudly and calling the baby an ill-fated thing that should not be brought into the house. Claire turned on her and said, low and sharp, "Say that thing about your granddaughter one more time." Mrs. Quinn spun toward her, eyes swollen and furious. "You destroyed this family," she hissed. Claire almost laughed from the bitterness of hearing the same logic again. If not blame the woman outside the family, then blame the one inside it, and if neither is enough, blame the child who never got to speak. Someone suggested Adrian should talk to his wife, because women at the edge still listened best to their husbands. Adrian knelt in front of Vivian with the careful sorrow of a man auditioning for the role of grieving father. "Give her to me," he said. "I promise I'll take care of everything." Vivian stared at him for so long that Claire felt she was witnessing the final collapse of an illusion. Then Vivian asked, "Take care of me the way you took care of Claire? The way your mother calls my daughter bad luck?" The corridor fell quiet. Vivian's voice had changed. It no longer wavered between confusion and pain. It carried decision. She said she would take her daughter home herself, through the front door, without ritual concealment, and without asking permission from anyone who had feared the child before she drew her first breath. Mason arrived with a photographer he trusted. The moment cameras appeared, some of the relatives stepped back. They still wanted control, but not visibility. That small hesitation was enough for Elise to call the police liaison and hospital administration. Law, in situations like these, rarely feels grand. It feels thin, improvised, dependent on who arrives in time. But even a thin barrier can matter if it interrupts a theft already in motion.
By late afternoon, Vivian was discharged against family pressure, still weak, still pale, but unbending. Claire and Mason rode with her to the Quinn family house. The sky had dimmed into a gray-blue evening by the time they reached the gate. Vivian stepped out, holding the white bundle herself. She moved slowly, one hand pressed against her healing abdomen, yet there was nothing fragile in the way she crossed the threshold. Mrs. Quinn blocked the doorway and pleaded, then demanded, then invoked omens and rituals. Vivian walked past her. Inside the house, the air smelled of incense, polished wood, and old authority. The nursery that had once been prepared for the baby remained locked at the end of the hall. Vivian turned toward it anyway, then stopped and chose the master bedroom instead, the room where so many lies had been spoken over her sleeping body. She laid her daughter down there for a few quiet minutes, opened the curtains, and said aloud that this child had a name. Grace Quinn. She would not be remembered as a thing, a sign, or a problem to be managed. What followed was not a dramatic reconciliation, but a debt taking shape. Vivian looked at Adrian and told him she knew about the files, the edits, the contract, and the role he had played in directing public hatred toward another woman to protect himself. Adrian tried once more to speak of family, reputation, and necessary decisions. Vivian answered that if family required her child to enter the world unwanted and leave it unnamed, then the word meant nothing to her anymore. When Claire left the house at dusk, Mason asked if she was all right. She shook her head and said she would not let this disappear. He understood. The case was no longer only about restoring her reputation. It had become a reckoning. After the simple funeral, Vivian never returned to the Quinn family home. She moved into her mother's apartment on Yuen Street, a narrow place with aging furniture, a cramped kitchen, and a small balcony overlooking an old almond tree. It was not elegant, but it was a house where no one called her grief bad luck. When she cried, no one told her to stop inviting misfortune. When she held the white newborn dress for an hour without speaking, no one snatched it away and told her to hide it. Her mother simply reheated water, sat beside her, and stroked her back. Claire visited on the third day. Vivian had lost weight so quickly that her face seemed carved down to grief and will alone.
On the table beside her was the tiny footprint card the hospital had managed to save, and next to it a handwritten name, Grace. "She has a name now," Vivian said without taking her eyes off the card. "I won't let them call her only the baby." Claire sat down and told her it was a beautiful name. No grand forgiveness passed between them. They had both done too much hurting for that, but they sat side by side like two women who had come through the same fire and were still carrying the smell of smoke. A week later, Vivian signed her first full statement. She handed over emails, edited files, a short recording accidentally captured the night she confronted Adrian, and messages in which he had urged her not to make things bigger. Mason prepared a second investigation, this time tracing not only the smear against Claire, but the broader misuse of communications money, the pattern of coercion inside the company, and allegations of harassment. Other women began to speak as well. One former employee described being pressured to drink on a business trip. Another recalled being told to backdate invoices for expenses that had no clean explanation. Separated, these facts could be dismissed. Together, they formed a system.
Claire came to understand that Adrian was not powerful merely because he was personally cruel. He had been made strong by the rings of protection around him. Senior leaders who valued performance over conduct, legal staff who avoided mess, human resources departments that translated fear into policy language, co-workers who knew and stayed quiet, and an online public eager to work for free whenever its prejudices were flattered. A hunter is rarely alone. The hunt requires infrastructure. The company eventually tried to retreat toward damage control. They offered Claire reinstatement once misunderstandings had been clarified. She refused. A workplace that had thrown her to the crowd and then called it a misunderstanding was not a place she intended to return to. Instead, she sought compensation under the law for harm to reputation and lost income. Her mother worried this would make future employers wary. Claire held her hand and said that if she went back, she would spend the rest of her life telling herself she had accepted what had been done to her. Her mother looked at her for a long time before nodding. Jobs, she said, can sometimes be found again. A person's face before herself is harder to recover. That night, Claire walked alone by the lake while early autumn wind moved across the water. She thought of Grace, a child who had barely entered the world and yet had altered the destinies of so many adults. She thought of Vivian, of Elise, of the other women stepping forward, and of the hundreds of anonymous comments that had once spat every ugly label they could find at her name. Then she understood something simple and terrible. Women's silence is rarely natural. It is taught, rewarded, demanded, polished, and enforced through countless instructions to keep the peace. To step out of it often costs blood, tears, work, marriage, even children. But once one woman steps out, the next can at least see where the door is. The judgments came in stages, as court decisions do. Claire won public correction, financial compensation, and a legal finding that the smear campaign had included fabricated material and deliberate amplification. Vivian secured her divorce and protection of her portion of the assets, while other proceedings continued to move through labor and criminal channels. Adrian was not destroyed in the theatrical way the crowd might have wanted. Real consequences are often less dramatic and more lasting. He lost office, influence, and the ability to hide behind ambiguity. More importantly, the record no longer belonged to him. 3 months later, Claire, Vivian, and Elise rented a small room on the second floor of an old house near the lake and opened a free advisory space for women facing online defamation, workplace harassment, or marriages in which silence was treated like virtue. The room held only a few desks, a shelf of legal resources, an aging printer, and a kettle that never seemed to empty. But on the first day, the sign "The Way Home" went up in the window. 2 women came in before noon. One had been exposed online by an ex-boyfriend. The other had been forced to quit work after childbirth and then mocked as a burden. On the windowsill, Vivian placed a small pot of white chrysanthemums. Under the soil, she tucked a slip of paper with Grace's name on it. "So she knows how to find us," she said, half joking, half not. Claire did not laugh. She only poured more water into the pot. Some losses never heal all the way. Some aches return whenever the weather turns. But unlike before, they no longer had to carry those aches alone. Most evenings after locking the office, Claire walked a long way before going home. The city still glowed the same way it always had. Traffic lights, food carts, new scandals blooming and fading by the hour. Sometimes, while scrolling, she would still find another hunt underway somewhere. A girl secretly filmed, a wife mocked for failing to keep her husband, a mother condemned for grieving in the wrong shape. Whenever that happened, Claire remembered Friday evening outside the company gate, the slap,
the crowd, the screens lighting up like 100 hungry eyes. Then she remembered Vivian carrying her daughter through the doorway, and her father's laboring voice telling her, even through illness, that if you are standing in the truth, then do not be afraid. The road back from having your name torn apart, your face taken from you, and your voice stripped away is never easy. But now, if another woman wanders into that darkness, at least one lamp is already lit and waiting. Chapter 11. The Trial of Names. Claire's civil suit over defamation and Vivian's divorce and property case moved forward almost in parallel, while financial inquiries and harassment complaints against Adrian continued to widen in the background. Journalists began referring to the combined matter as the Meridian chain of cases. Claire thought of it more simply. It was the moment when names that had been written wrongly were trying to return to their rightful places. On the first day in court, the hallway was crowded, but not with the same appetite as the people who had once devoured her online. Claire wore a plain white blouse and tied her hair neatly back. Vivian walked beside her, thinner than before, a small white flower pinned to her jacket in Grace's memory. Across from them, Adrian appeared with two lawyers, his polish dimmed but not gone. When he saw the two women standing together, he faltered for half a heartbeat. That tiny break in composure lightened something inside Claire. Men like him considered unpredictability their privilege. It mattered that he had finally lost it. A courtroom is not a place for moving monologues, only for statements that can survive evidence. Elise presented the chain methodically, the altered images, the seating contract, the garage footage, the threats by text, the internal emails, the professional and emotional damage inflicted on Claire and her family. Each file illuminated the next. When the parking garage video appeared on screen, the room seemed to hold its breath. There was Adrian, in a light shirt, pointing toward the elevator. There was Vivian, visibly pregnant, nodding before heading upstairs. No audio was needed. Everyone understood enough. Adrian's lawyers argued that he had merely been trying to calm an unstable spouse, that the footage proved no orchestration, that Claire's closeness to senior leadership could reasonably have caused misunderstanding, and that the investigative articles had unfairly turned opinion against him. Listening to them, Claire felt not rage, but a cold weariness. The old script was intact. Diminish the evidence, enlarge ambiguity, and make the woman defend not the harm done to her, but the purity of her character. When it was her turn, she stood and said she was not suing to prove she had lived flawlessly. She was suing because no one had the right to turn a living person into a target for public stoning, and then name the violence misunderstanding. Vivian spoke after her. Her hands whitened against the edge of the witness stand, but her voice did not tremble. She said plainly that she had been the one to slap Claire, and that she did not run from that fact. She had apologized privately already, but her wrongdoing, she said, had not emerged from nowhere. It had been cultivated by lies, manipulated images, and by the fear of ridicule her husband had learned how to use against her. Adrian's lawyer suggested she was motivated by divorce and resentment. Vivian turned toward Adrian and answered that her daughter was dead, and after hearing her in-laws refuse even then to welcome the child through the door, fear had lost its leverage over her.
Hey there! If you enjoy our audio content, don't forget to hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Most importantly, click subscribe and ring the bell to stay updated with everything Zuzu Audio. Support the channel and join our community today.